When a power-hungry, arrogant HOA president threatened to seize a quiet old man's home over a handcrafted wooden fence, he thought he was just bullying a defenseless retiree. He publicly humiliated the senior citizen, waving a clipboard and screaming that he was the absolute king of the neighborhood. But he had absolutely no idea that the quiet man in the dirty gardening gloves was a retired federal judge and the original real estate tycoon who literally owned the ground beneath the president's own mansion. This is the ultimate story of neighborhood revenge and why you should never poke a sleeping bear. Welcome to Whispering Pines, an elite, gated community where the lawns were perfectly manicured, the mansions were pristine, and the homeowners association was run like a ruthless dictatorship. At the head of this dictatorship was Greg. Greg was a 40-something mid-level corporate manager who had zero actual power at his day job, so he overcompensated by ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist. He drove around the community in a custom-painted golf cart, equipped with a flashing yellow light, actively hunting for people to punish. He fined children for leaving bicycles in their own driveways. He fined people if their grass was a quarter-inch too tall. In Greg's mind, he wasn't just the HOA president, he was the absolute supreme ruler of Whispering Pines. At the very end of the street lived Elias Thorne. Elias was a 70-year-old widower who kept entirely to himself. He was a quiet, deeply observant man who spent his days reading thick books on his porch and tending to his spectacular garden. After his wife passed away, Elias decided to build a beautiful, handcrafted cedarwood trellis in his front yard to support her favorite climbing roses. It was a stunning piece of woodworking, built with his own calloused hands. But to Greg, it wasn't a tribute to a late wife. It was an unauthorized architectural violation. Elias was on his knees in the dirt, peacefully planting the last of the rose bushes, when the obnoxious screech of golf cart brakes shattered the quiet morning. Greg aggressively leaped out of his cart, clutching his thick clipboard. He marched right onto Elias's pristine lawn, his expensive golf shoes trampling directly over a newly planted bed of flowers without a single ounce of care. "Stop right there, old man," Greg barked, his voice echoing loudly down the quiet street, intentionally trying to draw the attention of the neighbors. "Put the tools down immediately. You are in direct, blatant violation of the Whispering Pines community bylaws." Elias slowly stood up. He looked down at his crushed flowers and then up at Greg's flushed, angry face. Elias didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. "Good morning, Greg," Elias said, his voice deep, gravelly, and perfectly calm. "It's a beautiful cedar trellis. I checked the community guidelines. There are no restrictions on temporary garden support structures." "I decide what the restrictions are," Greg roared, stepping so close to Elias that the older man could smell his cheap cologne. "This neighborhood has a strictly enforced aesthetic. Wood is banned. We only allow white vinyl. You didn't submit a permit, you didn't pay the application fee, and you certainly didn't kiss the ring of the architectural committee." Greg violently ripped a piece of pink paper off his clipboard and shoved it directly into the chest of Elias's faded shirt. "That is a $5,000 fine," Greg sneered cruelly, "and if this piece of trash wood isn't torn down by tomorrow morning, I will double the fine. Do you understand me, you old fool?" Elias looked down at the bright pink piece of paper pinned against his chest. He took it slowly, his calloused hands folding it in half. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He looked at the crushed red roses under Greg's expensive golf shoes. "Greg," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying a heavy, sorrowful weight, "my wife Martha passed away last year. Those climbing roses were her absolute favorite. I built this trellis so they could grow exactly the way she wanted them to. I am asking you, man to man, to have a little bit of compassion and let this go." For a normal human being, that explanation would have been more than enough. But Greg was not a normal human being. He was a man completely intoxicated by his own microscopic amount of power. Greg rolled his eyes dramatically and let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Oh, please, spare me the sob story," Greg mocked, waving his hand dismissively. "Do I look like a therapist to you? I don't care if you built it for the Pope. The rules of Whispering Pines apply to everyone. If I let you keep this ugly wooden monstrosity, tomorrow someone will park an RV on their lawn. It's a slippery slope, and I am the wall that stops it." Elias's eyes hardened. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. "You are overstepping your authority as HOA President. The bylaws state that fines must be voted on by the board. You can't just hand them out because you feel like it." That was the absolute worst thing Elias could have said. Questioning Greg's authority was his ultimate trigger. Greg's face turned bright purple. He aggressively clicked his pen and furiously started scribbling on his clipboard again. He ripped off 2 more pink slips and threw them directly onto Elias's pristine green lawn. "There!" Greg shouted, pointing at the grass. "Another $5,000 for arguing with a neighborhood official, and another $5,000 for disturbing the peace. You are now $15,000 in debt to this association, you old relic." Several neighbors had stepped out onto their porches watching the commotion. Greg noticed his audience and decided to put on a show to prove his absolute dominance. He stepped within inches of Elias's face, lowering his voice to a malicious, venomous whisper. "Listen to me very carefully," Greg sneered. "If you don't pay these fines by tomorrow at noon, I will put a legal lien on your property. I will rack up the late fees until you are completely bankrupt, and then the HOA will foreclose on this house, kick you out onto the street, and sell it to someone who actually respects my rules. I can take your house, old man. Do not test me." Elias looked Greg dead in the eyes. He didn't step back. He didn't look afraid. "Greg," Elias said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "are you absolutely sure you want to go down this path?" Greg laughed, a high-pitched, mocking, deeply irritating sound. He spun around on his expensive golf shoes, got back into his customized cart, and sped away down the street. The yellow light on his roof flashed triumphantly. He had just crushed another resident's spirit, and to him, that was the ultimate victory. Elias stood alone on his lawn. He slowly bent down, picked up the crushed red rose, and then gathered the 3 pink fine tickets from the grass. He didn't tear them up in anger. He folded them neatly, placed them into the pocket of his faded plaid shirt, and walked quietly inside his house. The interior of Elias's home was not the simple, dusty dwelling of an ordinary retiree. He walked into a massive grand home office lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. The shelves were packed with heavy legal encyclopedias. On his grand oak desk sat a gleaming wooden judge's gavel, alongside framed photographs of Elias shaking hands with governors, senators, and presidents. Elias sat down in his heavy leather chair and picked up his sleek, modern smartphone. Before Elias makes the one single phone call that will completely obliterate this arrogant HOA president's entire life, take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button and like the video. It helps us bring you more satisfying stories of true justice every single day. Have you subscribed? Great. Now let's watch the hunter become the hunted. Elias dialed a private, unlisted number. It was answered on the very first ring. "Mitchell," Elias said, his deep voice echoing in the quiet, oak-paneled room. "I need you to pull the master foundational deeds for the Whispering Pines development." On the other end, his senior corporate attorney sounded shocked. "The master deeds, Your Honor? We haven't looked at those since your real estate firm built the neighborhood 30 years ago. Is there a problem?" "Yes," Elias replied smoothly, his eyes cold and focused. "It seems the current HOA president, a man named Greg, has forgotten who actually owns the dirt beneath his feet." What Greg didn't know, what nobody in the entire neighborhood knew, was that Elias Thorne wasn't just a retired federal judge. Long before he put on the black robe, Elias was the billionaire real estate tycoon who originally bought the massive plot of land and built the entire Whispering Pines community from scratch. When he retired to live in one of the houses with his late wife, he handed the day-to-day management over to the HOA. But he never sold the actual land. He leased the ground to the HOA on a 99-year foundational trust. "I want you to draft a notice of land lease termination for Greg's specific address," Elias commanded softly. "Cite a violation of the good faith and conduct covenant. Greg wants to play legal games over my wife's roses. Let's show him what real legal power looks like." Meanwhile, on the other side of the neighborhood, Greg was sitting in the HOA clubhouse feeling like an absolute king. He was loudly bragging to his assistant, dramatically slamming a heavy red stamp that read "Foreclosure Warning" onto Elias's property file, completely unaware of the Category 5 hurricane heading straight for his front door. The next evening, the Whispering Pines community clubhouse was packed to the brim. Greg had called an emergency town hall meeting, sending out mandatory attendance notices to every resident in the neighborhood. He didn't just want to punish Elias. He wanted an audience. He wanted to make a public, brutal example out of the old man to ensure that no one else would ever dare to question his authority again. Greg stood proudly behind the wooden podium at the front of the hall, adjusting the microphone. He looked out over the crowd of wealthy suburbanites, puffing out his chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Greg announced, his voice booming through the speakers, "we live in a premier neighborhood. Our property values remain high because we maintain absolute aesthetic purity. But unfortunately, some residents believe they are above the law." Greg dramatically pulled the file on Elias Thorne and held it up for the crowd to see. Mr. Thorne decided to build a hideous, unauthorized wooden structure on his front lawn. Greg continued, feigning disappointment. "When I issued a simple, standard warning, he became hostile. He refused to comply. Therefore, as your president, I have officially levied $15,000 in fines against his property. And since the deadline has passed without payment," Greg paused, savoring the moment, "the HOA is officially placing a lien on his house and initiating foreclosure proceedings." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, foreclosing on a 70-year-old widower over a wooden trellis. Even some of Greg's supporters thought he was going too far. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. The whispering instantly stopped. Every head in the room turned. Elias Thorne stepped into the hall. He wasn't wearing his gardening clothes anymore. He was wearing a sharply tailored, dark navy suit that fit him immaculately. He didn't look like a retired old man. He walked down the center aisle with the heavy, terrifying posture of a federal judge entering his courtroom. Tucked under his arm was a thick leather folder. Greg leaned into the microphone, a malicious sneer crossing his face. "Well, look who decided to show up. Mr. Thorne, have you brought your checkbook to pay the $15,000, or are you here to hand over the keys to your house in front of everyone?" Elias didn't stop walking until he was standing directly in front of the podium. He looked up at Greg, his expression as cold and hard as granite. "I didn't bring a checkbook, Greg," Elias said, his deep voice carrying through the silent room without even needing a microphone. "I brought a history lesson." Elias slowly opened his leather folder and placed a stack of heavy, ancient-looking, watermarked legal documents right on the edge of Greg's podium. "You love to talk about rules, Greg," Elias said softly. "Let's talk about the rules of the dirt you are currently standing on." Greg looked down at the stack of ancient, yellowed legal papers resting on his podium. He let out a nervous scoff, trying to maintain his tough guy image in front of the packed clubhouse. "What is this nonsense, Elias?" Greg sneered, pushing the documents back. "Are these fake historical records? Did you print these off the internet? I don't care about your history lesson. I care about my $15,000. "You should care, Greg," Elias replied, his voice echoing with the crushing weight of absolute authority. "Because if you knew how to actually read a property deed, you would know that you don't own the land your house sits on." A wave of confused whispers washed over the seated audience. Greg blinked, his arrogant facade cracking for the very first time. "What? What are you talking about? I bought my house for $2 million. I own the deed." "You own the bricks, the wood, and the glass," Elias corrected him smoothly. "But 30 years ago, when I bought these 500 acres of empty dirt to build Whispering Pines, I set up a foundational ground lease. Every single house in this neighborhood sits on land leased from Thorn Real Estate Holdings, my holding company." Greg's face suddenly lost all of its color. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the podium. Elias stepped closer, tapping the heavy parchment on the podium. "I handed the daily operations over to the HOA so the residents could govern themselves, but I kept the land to protect this community from exactly one thing: petty, power-hungry tyrants like you." That's impossible," Greg stammered, frantically flipping through the heavy legal documents. His eyes scanned the signatures. There it was, in bold black ink, signed 3 decades ago. Elias Thorn, sole proprietor. "It gets worse for you, Greg," Elias continued mercilessly. "Under Section 9 of the Master Ground Lease, the landowner, that's me, reserves the right to instantly terminate the land lease of any resident who violates the good faith and community conduct covenant. Fining a widower for planting his late wife's favorite roses is the exact definition of bad faith." Elias reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a single, crisp white legal envelope. He placed it directly onto Greg's chest, mirroring exactly what Greg had done with the pink fine ticket the day before. "What is this?" Greg whispered, his voice trembling so hard he could barely speak. "That is an official notice of land lease termination," Elias declared, turning to face the shocked audience of neighbors. "As of this exact moment, your house is sitting on my private property without a lease. You are trespassing on my land, Greg. You have 48 hours to pack your belongings, get out of your house, and leave Whispering Pines forever." The entire clubhouse erupted, not with anger, with applause. The sound of the neighborhood cheering was the final nail in Greg's coffin. His absolute power had completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. You can't do this," Greg cried out, tears of genuine panic welling up in his eyes. He grabbed the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "I paid $2 million for that house. If I lose the land, the bank will call in the mortgage. I'll be ruined. I'll be bankrupt." Elias looked down at the weeping, pathetic man. "You should have thought about the consequences before you trampled my wife's roses, Greg. You tried to make me homeless over a wooden trellis. You dug this grave yourself. Now, lie in it." Elias turned away from Greg and addressed the shocked, excited crowd of residents. "As the foundational landowner of Whispering Pines," Elias announced, his voice ringing with warmth and authority, "I am officially dissolving the current Homeowners Association Board, effective immediately. All outstanding fines are hereby cancelled." The crowd erupted into another massive wave of applause. "If you want to paint your front door blue, paint it. Elias continued, a genuine smile finally crossing his face. If your kids want to leave their bikes in the driveway, let them. And if you want to build a garden trellis, build it. This is a neighborhood, ladies and gentlemen, not a prison camp. Fast forward exactly 48 hours. The sunny, peaceful streets of Whispering Pines were treated to the most satisfying sight in the history of the neighborhood. A cheap, rented moving truck was parked in Greg's driveway. Greg, completely soaked in sweat, was frantically carrying heavy cardboard boxes out of his former mansion. His custom-painted golf cart with the yellow flashing light wasn't there. Elias's lawyers had legally seized it to cover the unpaid $15,000 fine Greg owed to the land trust. As Greg struggled with a particularly heavy box, dropping a lamp onto the concrete driveway, several neighbors stood on their front porches. They were holding coffee mugs, smiling, and waving goodbye to the tyrant who had made their lives miserable for years. A few streets down, far away from the noise of the moving truck, Elias Thorne was back in his favorite place. He had taken off his expensive suit and was back in his faded plaid shirt and dirty gardening gloves. He knelt peacefully in the soft dirt, gently tying a beautiful, vibrant red climbing rose to his handcrafted cedar wood trellis. The neighborhood was finally quiet, the tyrant was gone, and Martha's roses were going to bloom beautifully this year. And that brings us to the end of today's story on The Silent Observer. Do you think Elias went too far by terminating the land lease and taking Greg's house? Or did the corrupt HOA president get exactly the brutal karma he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you loved seeing this power-hungry neighborhood bully get put in his place, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a satisfying story of true justice. Until next time, stay silent and keep observing.